Obviously, we've seen a lot of conversations about how to reduce this overrepresentation, and we've seen efforts by police, by the YCJ, by the Canadian Criminal Code. We've seen, for example, attempts to provide a self-administered First Nations police, an attempt to provide culturally appropriate treatment in correctional facilities. The transfer of justice involved persons to Indigenous communities, changes to sentencing practices to give more of a consideration to things like HIDA principles of law or restorative justice, and trying to change the system by changing laws, as I mentioned, like with the Section 38(2)(d) of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. But these have not really been successful. For example, it's also very difficult for First Nations police to work in the communities that they also live in. Like, think about it, if you're living in a community of 1,000 people, everybody knows everybody. If you are the police officer that's responsible for policing that community, you can be viewed kind of sometimes with hostility. Or I grew up in Haida, and I know for a fact that Haida police officers responsible for policing the First Nations Reserve of Skidegate had a difficult time with this, because they would police the people that they're then going to see at the post office the next day. And those people, they might not be hostile, but they might also just want to avoid that person. They don't want to be seen in the community because they are aware of other person's business, and that person might try to avoid them. So it just makes for a really uncomfortable experience. In Canada, one thing that we maybe didn't talk about as much in this class is the Quebec Act, which allows Quebec to have a lot of say in how it administers its own laws. So the YCJ is a federal law, and it's the responsibility of the provinces to enact and enforce the YCJ. But with the Quebec Act, the province of Quebec has a little bit more autonomy in how it makes decisions about the justice system. And based on the Truth and Reconciliation report, one of the things that we need to begin to think about is, instead of changing the system, instead hand the system over to Indigenous communities and allow those communities to dictate what they feel is most appropriate. And one of the ways to begin to do this, even if we're not changing the system, is to allow Indigenous persons to dictate how we will begin to consider, for example, the treatment needs of Indigenous persons involved in the justice system. So the Life Balance Wheel was created by Drs. Louise Clark and Lorna Williams. It's meant to incorporate a holistic assessment and treatment strategy to plan what we would call case planning for Indigenous peoples. And it illustrates how fulfilled a person feels across multiple life dimensions. You can see a whole bunch of different ones here that we'll go through. And it helps to set goals towards achieving greater balance. So we'll zoom in on this slide and give you an example of what the wheel would actually look like. So you can see here, moving from top right down, we have different domains starting with mind and cognition, feelings and emotions, spirituality and life force, and body and physical well-being. The closer to the edge of the wheel, the better those different aspects within those domains are in terms of that person's own sort of self-reported perspective. So when looking at things like life skills, family, healing, wholeness, wellness, honesty, all of these things a person will rate themselves on. And then, for example, if you were to look at this particular wheel, you'll see maybe a person reporting deficits in wellness, healing, and in terms of land and nature. So these could be things that the person would want to work on to improve basically their sense of self. So we'll take a look here at the national incarceration rate of Indigenous youth before the YCJ, during the last part of the YOA, and then after 2003 during the YCJ. And what we can see here is that there's been a reduction in the rate of incarceration of Indigenous youth post-YCJ. So this might seem like a positive thing. However, if we take a look at this slide, what we can see is that when it comes to the reduction in incarceration during the YCJ, the reduction was less substantial for Indigenous persons compared to non-Indigenous persons. So basically what I mean by this is, yes, the rate of incarceration of Indigenous persons dropped during the YCJ, but the drop was lower in magnitude compared to the drop for non-Indigenous persons. So, for example, for white youth, the drop in the incarceration rate was much higher compared to the drop for Indigenous youth. So yes, Indigenous incarceration was being reduced, but we're actually, in some ways, things got worse because we see an even greater overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in custody. And in part because of these findings, some have simply argued that it's time to abolish the system of having a traditional white European approach to responding to Indigenous persons and instead provide Indigenous communities the right to make decisions about the justice system that they will use to prosecute its own members of its own community. So basically, when it comes to abolishing the system, while a lot of people are well-intentioned in trying to come up with, I know a lot of students in this class care about developing ideas for how to improve or, reduce overrepresentation of Indigenous persons. Abolishment of the system and returning Indigenous rights to Indigenous persons, allowing them to make their own decisions about the justice system, means that persons like myself don't get a say. It's not for me to provide unsolicited advice on how to reduce overrepresentation. It's about giving power back to the persons who want to be able to establish their own laws.